Without, the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlour of Laburnum Villa, the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess. The former, whose ideas about the game involved radical chances, was putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary peril that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady who was knitting by the fire. "Hark at the wind," said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it too. "I'm listening," said the latter, as he stretched out his hand over the chessboard. "I should hardly think that he'll come tonight anyway, with the road as it is," said his father. "Checkmate," said the son. "By day! All the slushy out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Paths a bog, roads a torrent. I suppose it's only because 2 houses and the road are let, they think that we don't matter." "Never mind, dear," said his wife soothingly. "Perhaps you'll win the next one." Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. His words died on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin in his thin grey beard. "Ah, there he is," said the young man, as the gate banged to loudly and heavy footsteps came towards the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste, and opening a door was heard condoling with the new arrival. And then he came back into the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye and rubicund of visage. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, "my wife and son." Well, the Sergeant Major took hands and took the proffered seat by the fire, watching contentedly as his host got out whiskey and tumblers and stirred a small copper kettle on the fire. At the third glass, his eyes got brighter and he began to talk, the little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts. He squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of doughty deeds and wild places, of wars and plagues and strange peoples. 21 years of it," said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son. "When he went away, he was a slip of a lad in the warehouse. Now look at him." "He don't look to have taken much harm," said Mrs. White politely. I'd like to go to India myself some day," said the old man. Just to look around a bit, "No, you're better off where you are," said the Sergeant Major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and, sighing softly, shook it again. I'd like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers and so forth," said the old man. "What was it you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris?" "Nothing," said the soldier hastily. "Leastways, nothing worth hearing." "What, monkey's paw?" said Mrs. White curiously. "Yeah, just a bit of, well, what you might call magic, perhaps," said the Sergeant Major offhandedly. His 3 listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down again. His host filled it for him. "All right," he began, fumbling in his pocket. "To look at, it's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy." He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son picked it up and examined it curiously, and then handed it to his father. And what's special about it, Morris?" asked Mr. White, placing it back on the table. "It had a spell put on it by an old fakir," said the Sergeant Major. "Very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and those that interfered with fate did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it." His manners were so impressive that his hearers were conscious that their light laughter jarred somewhat. "Well, why don't you have your 3 wishes then, sir?" said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier regarded him the way that middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth. "I have," he said quietly, his blotchy face whitening. And did you really have The 3 wishes granted? Asked Mrs. White. I did, said the Sergeant Major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. And has anybody else wished? Persisted the old lady. The first man had his 3 wishes, yeah. I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw. His tone was so grave that a hush fell upon the group. Well, if you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, is it, Morris? Said the old man at last. What do you keep it for? The soldier shook his head. Fancy, I suppose. I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It's caused me enough mischief as it is. Besides, nobody will buy it. They think it's a fairy tale, most of them, and those who do think anything of it, they want to try it first and pay me afterwards. Well, if you could have another 3 wishes, said the old man, would you take them? I don't know, said the other. I just don't know. He took the paw and, dangling it between his forefinger and thumb, he suddenly threw it in the fire. Hey, no! Mr. White, with a cry, stooped down and snatched it up. Let it burn, old man, said the soldier solemnly. No, 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 no. If you don't want it, Morrison, give it to me. I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Go on, pitch it in the fire like a sensible man. But no, Mr. White shook his head and examined his new possession closely. How'd you do it? The Sergeant Major sighed. You hold it up in your right hand and wish out loud. But I warn you, old man, sounds like the Arabian Nights, said Mrs. White as she rose and began to set the supper. Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me, she said. Her husband drew the talisman from his pocket, and all 3 burst into laughter as the Sergeant Major caught him urgently by the arm. If you must wish, he said, wish for something sensible. Mr. White dropped the monkey's paw back into his pocket and motioned his friend to the table, and in the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten. Afterwards, the 3 sat listening enthralled to a second instalment of the soldier's adventures in India. If that tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than everything else he's been telling us, said Herbert as the door closed behind their guest, we shan't make much of it. Did you give him anything for it, Father? Inquired Mrs. White, regarding her husband closely. A trifle, he said, colouring slightly. Yeah, he didn't want it, but I made him take it, and he pressed me again to throw it away. Not likely, said Herbert. Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be an emperor, Father, to begin with, and then he won't get henpecked. He darted round the table, pursued by Mrs. White, who wielded an antimacassar, while Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously. You know what? I don't know what I do want to wish for, he said. It seems to me I've got all I want already. Well, if you cleared the house payments, you'd be happier though, wouldn't you? Said Herbert, with his hand on his shoulder. Why not wish for £200? That should cover it, shouldn't it? His father, smiling shamefacedly at his own credulity, held up the talisman as his son, with a solemn face somewhat marred by a wink at his mother, sat down and struck a few impressive chords on the piano. I wish for £200, said the old man distinctly. Now, a fine crash from the piano greeted his words, but that was interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. Hey! It moved, he said, with a glance of disgust at the object which he'd thrown down onto the floor. As I made the wish, it twisted in my hand, like a snake or something. Well, I don't see any money, said his son, as he picked up the paw and placed it on the table, and I bet I never shall. Oh, it must have been your fancy, Father, said his wife, regarding him anxiously. No, he shook his head, but well, never mind, though. There's no harm done. That gave me a bit of a shock, I must say. They sat down again by the fire while the 2 men finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old man started nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. A silence, unusual and depressing, settled on the 3 of them, and it lasted until the old couple rose to retire. I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed, said Herbert as he bade them good night, and something horrible squatting on top of your wardrobe, watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains. He sat alone in the darkness for a while after they'd gone up, gazing at the dying fire and seeing faces in it. The last of these were so horrible and so simian that he shuddered slightly. And then with an uneasy laugh, he felt on the table for a glass of water to throw over it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw. And with another little shiver, he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed. In the brightness of the wintry sun the next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, Herbert laughed at his fears of the night before. There was an air of prosaic wholesomeness now about the room, which it had lacked the previous night, and the dirty, shriveled little monkey's paw was pitched on the sideboard with a carelessness which betokened no great belief in its powers. All old soldiers are the same, I suppose, said Mrs. White. The idea of our listening to that nonsense. How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they could, how could £200 hurt you, father? Might drop on his head from the sky, said Herbert. No, said the old man. No, Morris said that the things happened so naturally that you might, if you so wished, attribute it to coincidence. Don't break into the money before I get back from work, then, said Herbert as he rose from the table. His mother laughed, followed him to the door, and watched him amble down the road. And returning to the breakfast table, she smiled again at her husband's credulity. All of which did not, however, prevent her from scurrying with unusual haste to the front door when the postman knocked, nor prevent her from referring somewhat shortly to retired sergeant majors of bibulous habits when she found that the post brought only a tailor's bill. Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home, she said as they sat at dinner. I dare say, said Mr. White, pouring himself some beer. But for all that, the thing, it moved in my hand. I'll swear to that. You thought it did, said the old lady soothingly. It did, replied Mr. White. There was no thought about it. What's the matter? But his wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside who, peering in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind whether to enter or not. In mental connection with the £200, Mrs. White noticed that the stranger was well dressed and wore a glossy silk hat. 3 times he paused at the gate and walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand upon it, and then with a sudden resolution flung it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White, at the same moment, placed her hands behind her, and hurriedly unfastening the strings of her apron, she put it beneath the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into the room. He gazed at her furtively and listened in a preoccupied fashion as the old lady apologized for the appearance of the room and for her husband's coat, a garment which he usually reserved for the garden. She then waited as patiently as her sex would permit for him to broach his business, but he seemed strangely reluctant to speak. I was asked to call, he said at last, and he stooped and picked a piece of cotton from his trousers. I come from Moore and Meggins. The old lady started. Is anything the matter? Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it? Her husband interposed. There, mother, he said. Sit down now. Don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir. I'm sorry, said the man. Is he hurt? Demanded the mother. The visitor bowed in assent. Badly hurt, but he's not in any pain. Oh, thank God, said the old woman, clasping her hands. Thank God for that. And then she broke off, as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned upon her, and she saw the awful confirmation of her fears in the man's averted face. She caught her breath and, turning to her slower-witted husband, laid her trembling hand on his. There was a lengthy silence. "He was caught in the machinery," said the visitor at length. "Caught in the machinery," replied Mr. White. "Yes, of course." He sat staring out of the window and, taking his wife's hand between his, pressed it as he had been wont to do in their old courting days nearly 40 years before. "He was the only one left to us," he said, turning gently to the visitor. The man coughed and, rising, walked slowly to the window. "The firm wishes me to convey their sincere sympathy with you in your great loss," he said, without looking around. "Well, I hope you will understand that I am only their servant and I am only obeying orders." There was no reply. "I'm to tell you that Moore and Meggins disclaim all responsibility. They admit no liability, but in consideration of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation." Mr. White dropped his wife's hand and, rising to his feet, gazed with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words, "How much?" £200 was the answer. Unconscious of his wife's scream, the old man smiled faintly, put out his hands, and dropped, a senseless heap, to the floor. In the huge new cemetery, some 2 miles distant, the old couple buried their dead son and came back to a house steeped in shadows and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it. They remained in a state of expectation, as though of something else to happen, something to lighten this load too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed, and these expectations gave way to resignation, the hopeless resignation of the old, which is sometimes wrongly called apathy. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for they had nothing to talk about now, and their days were long to weariness. About a week after the burial, the old man woke suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand, and found himself alone in bed. The room was in darkness, and the sound of subdued weeping came from the window. He raised himself up and listened. "Look, come back, my dear," he said tenderly. You'll be cold. It's colder for my son," said the old woman, and wept afresh. The sounds of her sobs died away on his ears. The bed was warm and his eyes were heavy with sleep. He dozed fitfully and then slept until a sudden wild cry from his wife awoke him with a start. "The paw!" she cried wildly. "The monkey's paw!" He started up in alarm. "Where? What's the matter?" She came stumbling across the room towards him. "I want it," she said. You've not destroyed it, have you?" "No, it's in the old parlour. It's on the bracket. Why?" She cried and laughed at the same time, and bending over kissed his cheek. "I only just thought of it. Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?" "Think of what?" "The other 2 wishes. We've only had 1 wish." "Well, was that not enough?" "No. We'll have 1 more. Go and get the monkey's paw. Wish our boy alive again." "Oh, you're mad. Get it," the old woman said. "Get it quickly and wish. Oh, my boy, my poor boy, I will see you again." Her husband lit a candle. "Get back to bed with you. You don't know what you're saying. We had the first wish granted. Why not the second?" "It's a coincidence," stammered the old man. "Get the monkey's paw and make another wish," cried his wife, quivering now with excitement. The old man turned and regarded her firmly. "He has been dead for 10 days. And besides, I only tell you this now. I could only recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to look at then, how now? Bring him back, cried the old woman, and dragged her husband towards the door. Bring him back! Do you think that I fear the child that I have nursed? The old man went down in the darkness and felt his way to the parlour and then to the mantelpiece. The talisman was in its place, and a horrible fear that the unspoken wish might bring his mutilated son before him before he could escape from the room seized him, and he caught his breath as he found that he'd lost the direction of the door. His brow cold with sweat, he felt his way around the table and groped along the wall until he found himself in the small passage with that unwholesome thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant. It seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was suddenly afraid of her. Wish, she said in a strong voice. It is foolish and wicked. Wish! He raised his hand. I wish my son alive again. The talisman fell to the floor, and he sank trembling into a chair as the old woman with burning eyes walked to the window and raised the blind. He sat there until he was chilled with cold, glancing occasionally at that poor figure peering through the window. The candle end, which had burned below the rim of the china candlestick, was throwing pulsating shadows on the ceiling and walls until a flicker larger than the rest, it expired. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, crept back to his bed. And a minute later, the old woman climbed in silently and apathetically beside him. Neither of them spoke. The clock ticked. A stair creaked. A mouse scurried noisily through the wall. The darkness was oppressive, and after lying for some time, screwing up his courage, Mr. White took the box of matches and, striking one, went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs, the match went out, and he paused to strike another. And at that exact moment, a knock sounded on the front door, so quietly and stealthily as to be scarcely audible. The matches fell from his hand and spilled in the passage. He stood motionless, his breath suspended until the knock was repeated. Then he turned, fled back to his room, and slammed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house. What's that? Cried the old woman, starting up. It's a rat, said the old man. It's just a rat. It passed me on the stairs. His wife sat up in bed. A loud knock resounded through the house. It's Herbert, she said. She ran to the door, but her husband was before her, and catching her by the arm, held her tightly. What are you going to do? It's my boy. It's Herbert. I forgot that it's 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let me go. I must open the door. For God's sake, don't let him in, cried the old man. You're afraid of your own son. Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert. I'm coming. There was another knock, and another. The old woman, with a sudden wrench, broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed her to the landing and called after her as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle back and the bolt drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket. And then the old woman's voice, strained and panting, "The bolt!" she called up to him. "Come down, I can't reach it." But her husband was on his knees, groping wildly on the floor in search of the monkey's paw. If he could only find it before the thing outside got in. A perfect fusillade of knocks now reverberated through the house, and he heard the scraping of a chair as his wife pushed it against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at that moment he found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it still rang through the house. He heard the chair drawn back and the door opened. The cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long, loud wail of disappointment and grief gave him the courage to run down to his wife's side and then go out to the gate beyond. The street lamp flickering opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road.